On a crisp October morning, Edgar Mitchell found a laminated notice taped to his mailbox. Driveway use is now restricted, it read in bold HOA font. He peeled the paper slowly, careful not to tear it, though a small part of him wished it would rip. The plastic crinkled in his hand as he walked back up the path, shoes brushing over leaves freshly fallen on the sidewalk. Silver Ridge wore autumn like a shawl. Amber trees raked lawns, the occasional whiff of chimney smoke. It should have been a quiet day. Inside their one-story brick home, Ruth looked up from her sewing basket. She was threading a needle with that precision honed from decades of reading to restless children. Without asking, she glanced at the paper in his hand and said, "Well, Bev's finally found something new to regulate besides flag colors." Edgar gave a short snort and passed the notice over. "Apparently, I'm improperly using our driveway. She's got the nerve. You haven't moved that Buick in a week, and it's still straighter than the street sign she had them install last spring." He didn't answer. Instead, he sat down in his porch chair, creaky and wooden, always angled just enough to see the HOA office across the cul-de-sac. His coffee, lukewarm by now, rested on the armrest. He took a sip, lips tightening at the bitterness. The porch had been his favorite retreat since retirement. He could hear the squirrels scurrying and the low rumble of Carl's push mower. The morning held everything in its right place except for that notice. Around 11, Beverly Crane herself approached clipboard in hand. Blazer pressed every strand of her gray-streaked bob perfectly in place. She didn't ring the bell. She smiled. "Good morning, Edgar," she said as if she were delivering fresh muffins, not policy enforcement. "Just wanted to make sure you received our new driveway regulations." He stood without urgency. Received and read. "Oh, wonderful," she said. "We've been noticing some inconsistencies, vehicles not in motion for extended periods, driveways looking underutilized." "They're driveways, Beverly, not highways." She laughed, a sound that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm sure you understand. Maintaining a consistent appearance is vital to Silver Ridge's values." Ruth appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Values or vanity," she murmured, not quite softly enough. Beverly turned. "Mrs. Mitchell, always a pleasure." Ruth smiled tightly. "If you say so." After Beverly left, Edgar sat again. Ruth brought out a plate of warm cornbread and set it on the rail beside him. She didn't need to ask what he was thinking. Later that afternoon, he made his way down to the local cafe, the kind where booths were lined with vinyl and the coffee never stopped flowing. Lydia was behind the counter, hair in a tight bun apron dusted with flour. "You get one too?" she asked as soon as he entered. He nodded. "Mailbox?" She sighed. "You and Carl and half the folks who don't show up to her little HOA socials. Veterans mostly. You're not on the board anymore." Lydia shook her head. "Voted off last spring. Bev didn't like my lax enforcement." Her words. He sipped his second coffee slowly, letting the bitterness ground him. The cafe buzzed with whispers and clinks of ceramic. A toddler laughed at the next booth over. Life in Silver Ridge didn't usually thrum like this. That evening, Edgar sat at the kitchen table reading glasses, perched on his nose, a thick binder opened beside him. The official HOA bylaws smelled faintly of old ink and carpet glue. He flipped through the appendices while Ruth prepped a small casserole. He paused at Article 5, Section B amendments and quorum requirements. His eyes narrowed. The new driveway policy hadn't been voted on properly. No quorum, no posted notice, no minutes. No paper trail at all. He reached for a pencil from the ceramic cup Ruth had painted long ago. "World's okayest husband," it read. He made a note in the margin, double-underlined a key phrase, and ran a fingertip across the lines as if to be sure they hadn't shifted in the lamplight. He closed the binder with a soft thud. "They want compliance," he mutters. "Let's give it to them." Edgar moved his sedan forward 3 inches the next day. It still blocked nothing, but now it technically obeyed the rule. He took his time doing it too, measuring from the sidewalk using an old folding ruler, then pulling the car forward slowly, carefully, until it aligned with a chalk line he'd drawn the night before. Ruth watched from the porch, thermos in hand, expression unreadable behind her bifocals. "This reminds me of that HOA letter from '97, she said as he stepped back to admire the new angle. "Remember how you responded?" Edgar didn't look away from the car. With blueprints and silence. The breeze had cooled since last week. October was settling in properly. Birds pecked at the feeder and skeleton decorations began to appear in front yards with varying degrees of commitment. A life-size inflatable pumpkin, 2 houses down, swayed gently, half deflated. By mid-morning, a fresh envelope arrived on the Mitchells' doorstep. This one didn't come with lamination, just a folded sheet in a standard HOA envelope bearing the polite but pointed tone of Beverly's enforcement team. Infraction notice. Partial driveway. Obstruction. Fine amount, 150 $100. Please remit within 10 business days. Ruth scanned it over his shoulder. Partial obstruction. Of what good taste. Edgar walked back to the driveway, bent down, and began to mark precise measurements with sidewalk chalk. He used a leveler to draw a diagonal across the gravel edge, aligning his parking angle to an exact 43 degrees. He adjusted the sedan again, now pointing gently toward the street, as if ready to leap into motion at any moment. Across the way, Beverly stood on her porch, arms folded. Even from this distance, her tight-lipped frown was visible. In the afternoon, Chuck Dawson stopped by in his cruiser. He didn't use the siren. Instead, he stepped out in khaki slacks and a navy jacket that stretched a bit across the shoulders, more neighbor than chief today. He walked up the path with a friendly nod. "Morning, Edgar." "Chuck." The 2 men stood a moment. Chuck gestured toward the driveway with a subtle lift of his chin. "Heard you got another letter. 2, actually. Want to see the angle?" Chuck offered a small smile. "I'm just saying, might be easier to move the car and keep things peaceful." Edgar returned the smile. "Peace requires understanding." Chuck paused, then added, "And sometimes it just requires parking in the garage. Can't get the Buick in anymore." Ruth's converted it into a seed-starting lab. From behind the screen door, Ruth chimed in, "Tell him about the tomatoes." Edgar turned. "We're cultivating an heirloom strain. Very stubborn." Chuck gave a short laugh and shook his head. "You're something else. Lemonade?" Edgar asked. Chuck hesitated, then accepted. Ruth brought out 2 glasses and a small plate of butter cookies. Chuck leaned on the porch rail as birds fluttered at the feeder behind them. "You know Bev's got her eye on you. She should look closer at her own books," Ruth muttered. Chuck raised an eyebrow. "You got something?" "Not yet," Edgar said, "but we're curious." That evening, Ruth pulled out her tablet and began sorting through scanned HOA receipts from the last year documents she'd collected quietly over months of online newsletters and budget bulletins. She pinched and zoomed, tapping slowly. Meanwhile, in the backyard, Edgar mounted a new birdhouse on the wooden post nearest the hedge. It looked standard pine painted sky blue, little perch, but inside was a tiny audio recorder set to loop every 6 hours. Its angle faced neatly toward the HOA's small office across the street. As the sun dipped behind the fir trees, a rumble echoed down the road. Sam's tow truck turned into Silver Ridge hazard lights blinking. He parked just behind the Mitchells' driveway and got out slowly, adjusting his cap and stretching his back. "Hey there," Sam called. "You, Edgar, I am. Got a work order to tow your sedan. Blocking visibility from sidewalk access or some nonsense." Edgar nodded. "Check the angle, 43 degrees. No encroachment." Sam walked around the car, whistling low. "Well, I'll be. You're good." He scratched his chin, looked back at the truck, then grinned. "I'll put in the report. Tow, canceled target, fully compliant." Edgar offered a handshake. "Appreciate it. Always a pleasure to dodge unnecessary drama." As Sam pulled away, Ruth came out holding the tablet. "I think we found something," she said. She turned the screen toward Edgar. A landscaping invoice stood out among the digital stack. Why did HOA Landscaping pay $3,200 to a company registered to Bev's niece? The envelope was plain creased at the corners. Inside, a typed list of 14 names and how Beverly had fined or silenced each one. Edgar unfolded the single sheet on the kitchen table while Ruth stirred a pot of cider, its cinnamon warmth curling through the house. He didn't speak, just traced each line slowly. Every name came with a date and a charge: improper garden gnome placement, excessive porch lighting, outdated mailbox paint. At the bottom, typed in italics, "More exist. These are only the ones who spoke to me. Keep going." LM. Ruth leaned over his shoulder. LM. Edgar exhaled. Someone watching. Someone tired. Ruth tapped the margin where May Jenkins' name appeared. "She's LM," she said with quiet certainty. Outside, leaves skittered across the sidewalk in thin, dry waves. Porch lights flickered on even before sunset, the sky already bruising with dusk. In the distance, children giggled around carved pumpkins on the porch steps. They made their way to Lydia's cafe before it got fully dark. The bell above the door gave its usual tired chime as they stepped in. The room was warm with low amber lighting and the aroma of pumpkin pie. Booths were filled with regulars' neighbors with knit scarves and reading glasses, coffee mugs clutched like sacred relics. Lydia stood behind the counter wiping down a plate. "Evening Mitchell," she called. "Something sweet or something seditious?" Ruth smiled. "Both, if you've got 'em." Edgar took their usual table near the bulletin board. He noticed a new flyer, Silver Ridge Harvest Fest. Volunteers needed tucked below it were others. A blood drive lost, Cat Notice Book Club, sign up. All carefully curated, all friendly. But the looks exchanged between tables hinted at something more. Quiet acknowledgments. A raised brow from Carl, a knowing nod from Lydia. Edgar ordered decaf. Ruth asked for cider. They sat in silence until Carl Jenkins slid into the booth beside them with 2 sugar packets and a grunt. "You're not the first she's come after," he said without preamble, "but you might be the first who knows how to write back in legalese." Edgar tilted his head. "You get one of these." He tapped the folded list in his coat pocket. Carl chuckled. 3 times in 21 alone. May got 4. Told her she couldn't fly that military service flag because it clashed with visual harmony. He made air quotes with his fingers. "Did you pay?" Carl's grin faded. "Eventually. But not before I built a 10-foot scarecrow and told Bev it was seasonal art." He paused. "She fined me twice." As Carl walked away to grab napkins, Lydia leaned over from behind the counter. "Funny how every letter starts with, 'To protect the beauty of our neighborhood,' and ends with a check written to an unverified vendor." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Unverified?" Lydia smiled thinly. "I'm a widow, not blind." Edgar stirred his decaf slowly. "There's something shifting." At that moment, Beverly's SUV rolled by, tires crunching over scattered leaves. She slowed just enough for the headlights to scan the cafe's windows, then continued turning left down Magnolia Lane. Her face had been expressionless, but her gaze had lingered. Elliot, the HOA treasurer, had been sitting quietly in a corner booth half-shielded by a hanging fern. As Ruth rose to get a refill, she mentioned half-casually, half-deliberately, "Of course, those landscaping receipts were dated 2 weeks before the board even approved them." Elliot froze a spoon halfway to his mouth. He blinked twice, then stood abruptly mumbling something about early mornings and bookkeeping. As he passed their table, he muttered under his breath, eyes forward, "You didn't hear it from me, but the real receipts don't match the board reports." Ruth barely moved. Noted. The bell chimed as he left. Later, as the cafe cleared and mugs emptied, Ruth made her way to the back corner where May Jenkins sat knitting with quiet purpose. Ruth didn't sit. She simply rested her hand on the edge of the table and said, "Thank you." May looked up, her eyes steady. She's gone after the week and quiet too long. It was time. When they returned home, Edgar headed to the hallway closet. Ruth stood near the door brushing crumbs from her sleeve. "I think it's time you dust off your old ID card," she said. Edgar didn't hesitate. Already did. "It's in my sock drawer." The letter Edgar dropped into the HOA mailbox had 7 pages, 5 appendices, and 1 very unexpected line in the signature block, "Retired Federal Property Inspector." It was early enough that the dew hadn't yet lifted from the grass. Edgar stood there for a beat longer after the mailbox clanged shut, hands resting in the pockets of his windbreaker. Ruth waited by the sidewalk, arms crossed over her cardigan. A few houses away, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. She thought this was a driveway dispute, Ruth said. She has no idea what kind of driveway she's just parked across. Edgar's smile was thin. Time to widen the road. The Silver Ridge HOA office sat awkwardly at the end of the cul-de-sac, a repurposed double-wide trailer dressed in beige paint and vinyl siding. Inside it smelled faintly of laminate and lemon polish. A wall of pamphlets offered advice on seasonal planting mailbox guidelines and the dangers of backyard sheds that didn't match house trim. Beverly stood behind the counter when Edgar arrived 20 minutes later to deliver a courtesy copy in person. She wore a tailored maroon blouse and a pinched expression. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her tone all sugar over gravel. "Another morning delivery." Edgar placed the envelope on the counter with a quiet tap. "Formal request for internal audit under HOA bylaw. 4.3c. Including expense review vendor ledger and records of board voting activity for the past 18 months. Beverly's smile froze like a glitching screen. "That won't be necessary. Clause 43C says otherwise." He nodded, turned, and walked out without waiting for her to reply. That afternoon, Ruth sat at her kitchen desk, the tablet propped beside her tea. Oregon's open records law was precise, and she knew exactly how to phrase the request. Within the hour, she submitted it via certified email, CC'd to Elliot and the Regional Oversight Board. At the same time, Elliot was fumbling through a loosely attended HOA meeting in the back corner of the community center. A few neighbors had shown up out of curiosity, May Carl and a couple who'd recently moved from Phoenix. Lydia brought cookies. Beverly led the meeting with her usual mix of charm and control, glossing over maintenance schedules and landscaping fees. But when Ruth's name came up in the subject of records requests, Elliot's clipboard slipped. He muttered, "We've already got duplicate vendor payments to sort." Beverly shot him a look that could melt linoleum. "Thank you, Elliot. That'll be all." Chuck Dawson, who had been leaning near the door sipping from a travel mug, raised his eyebrows. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave either. Later that evening, Ruth received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Careful bookkeeping." Inside was a scanned page of what looked like an internal HOA expense sheet. Highlighted line items included tree trimming, signage repair, and seasonal enhancements. One of the vendor names matched the earlier landscaping invoice, Bev's niece. She showed Edgar as he stirred their evening stew. "She's slipping," he said. "Too many hands in too many gardens." Back at the HOA office, Beverly sat stiffly at her desk. She'd skimmed the audit request once then again, and had paused when her eyes reached the signature block. The words had chilled her fingers. Edgar Mitchell, retired federal property inspector. She'd stood abruptly muttering something about organizing the back storage and disappeared behind a half-closed door. Her footsteps didn't sound confident. The next morning, Ruth went to put out the recycling and noticed something off. The lid of the bin had been closed hastily, the edge not properly clipped. Inside, papers were jostled. Her newspaper, neatly stacked the night before, was now upside down, a corner torn. She called over her shoulder. "Did you touch the recycling?" "No," Edgar replied from the porch where he was oiling the hinges of his chair. Ruth closed the lid slowly. "She's getting nervous," she said. Edgar looked up. "Good." All around the neighborhood, Harvest Fest flyers had started to disappear from lampposts and bulletin boards. Where they once hung bright with glitter glue and construction paper leaves, there were now only strips of torn tape and faded outlines. The winds of fall were picking up, and so it seemed was the tension. With Harvest Fest canceled due to safety concerns, May and Carl hosted a porch potluck instead. Every folding chair in Silver Ridge was occupied. From curb to stoop, their yard transformed into a beacon of warm resistance. Strings of amber lights stretched from the mailbox post to the maple tree, flickering gently against the fall breeze. Flags made of gingham and paper leaves fluttered above pie tables while kids chased each other with half-raked bundles of foliage. An old transistor radio balanced on a crate hummed Patsy Cline into the dusk. The entire block turned out, baskets in hand, folding chairs under arms. Ruth arrived with 2 loaves of cornbread and a covered pot of chili. Edgar followed behind, carrying mugs and his weathered thermos. Lydia arrived last, hoisting a carrier of cider like it was contraband. She poured into mason jars with a smile that held both pride and defiance. "You cancel fall pie," she muttered. "You declare war on this entire zip code." Chuck Dawson leaned against the Jenkins porch railing, cup in hand, surveying the scene. He hadn't come in uniform tonight, just flannel jeans and a hint of doubt in his jawline. Beverly was nowhere to be seen, but her absence was loud. A few neighbors glanced toward her house every so often, catching faint curtain shifts or the glint of binoculars behind the second-floor blinds. As platters emptied and the night grew cooler, conversation turned confessional. 3 violations in 1 week, Lydia said, sliding onto a bench beside Edgar and Ruth. 1 for the color of my snapdragons. 1 for the old bench I put by the rose bush. And 1 for humming. Humming said it was an audio disturbance. She shook her head. "I've been humming that tune since the Nixon administration." Chuck gave a short laugh but didn't comment. He was listening. Carl clinked a spoon to his cider jar. To the return of common sense, he said, and a quiet round of cheers followed. Someone raised a pie slice. A kid somewhere let out a whoop. The moment was gentle but charged. May, meanwhile, moved quietly through the crowd, refilling cider and trading half-sentences with nearly everyone. When she reached Ruth, she set down a folded napkin beside her plate. "From a friend," she said. Then she moved on. Inside the napkin, barely noticeable, was a USB drive the size of a fingernail. Edgar and Ruth left soon after, citing early bedtimes and sore knees. The truth was, the potluck had served its purpose. Back home, Edgar clicked on the office lamp, the light pooling over an old laptop. He plugged in the drive. A folder appeared, Reimbursements 2022-2023. It contained spreadsheets, dozens, all formatted with neat cells and itemized expenses. But there, repeated across pages, was the name Consulting and Beauty, LLC, linked to Beverly's niece as the registry records confirmed. Gardening consultations, HOA leadership workshops, even a charge for neighborhood aesthetic enhancement. Ruth sat beside him, flipping between invoices and HOA board minutes. "Look at this," she said. These expenses were reimbursed during the same quarter that Beverly pushed a dues increase. Edgar leaned in. "And the addresses on the service records?" He scrolled cross-referenced. The last address wasn't familiar until he pulled up a property record. "Beverly's cabin," he said softly, "in Bend. HOA funds paid for work done at her vacation house." Ruth didn't blink. "This isn't just HOA pettiness anymore," she said. "This is fraud." The community center hadn't seen this many people since the free shingles seminar in 2009. Every folding chair was occupied. Some folks stood at the back, clutching styrofoam coffee cups or arms folded across vests. A slow hush fell over the room as Beverly Crane approached the podium, clipboard in hand, blazer-pressed pearls neatly resting on her collarbone. Paper pumpkins dangled from twine overhead. The scent of cinnamon rolls from an earlier senior luncheon still lingered, but tonight the room was thick with something else: expectation. Beverly tapped the microphone. "Good evening, neighbors. I thank you all for attending on such short notice. As your HOA president, it is my duty to maintain grace and order, particularly when confusion arises from circulating misinformation." Her smile was wide but brittle. From the second row, Ruth leaned in and whispered to Edgar, "You can dress up a clipboard with pearls, but in the end, a lie's still a lie." Edgar stood slowly, briefcase in hand. "I'd like to speak," he said. Beverly faltered. "I believe homeowner commentary is limited to the final portion." "Bylaw 2.6a, Edgar said. "Transparency clause. Any homeowner may present evidence related to financial misconduct for review by the board and community." A beat of silence. Then Beverly forced a shrug. "Proceed." Edgar stepped toward the projector. He placed a USB stick into the hall's community laptop, an ancient model that hummed as it woke. The screen flickered, then displayed a spreadsheet titled Reimbursements and Disbursements 2022 to 2023. Rows and columns filled the screen. Vendor names, payment dates, amounts. Consulting and Beauty, LLC. Edgar read aloud. Received 12 payments totaling over $14,000. He clicked again. Landscaping expenses for addresses outside our HOA jurisdiction, including one belonging to a Beverly Crane. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elliot, seated to the side, cleared his throat. Those payments weren't authorized, not by board vote. I wasn't shown those invoices until after. Beverly straightened. This is taken grossly out of context. Ruth stepped forward. We have context. She tapped her tablet. The speakers in the room hissed slightly, then played a clipped recording. I am the HOA. Beverly's voice rang out. They'll do what I say, or they can find another place to live, a collective intake of breath. Carl rose from the third row, his voice shaking. You fined my grandkid for sidewalk chalk while you were embezzling? No, Beverly snapped. That's not. This is a smear campaign. I've served this community. Chuck Dawson stood near the wall in uniform, arms crossed. I think he said evenly, we need to pause this meeting and start a vote. Some nodded. A few clapped, but no one cheered. Edgar turned slowly toward the room, his expression unreadable. I propose a hat box from the cafe held folded slips of paper. Lydia called names one by one. Yes or no, speeches, no shouting, just choices. The community center was quieter than it had ever been. Thanksgiving wreaths hung modestly on the doors. A string of faux maple leaves wound around the window trim, and a folding table in the back offered slices of pumpkin pie and decaf. Outside, the temperature had dipped. Breath fogged on glass coats stayed zipped, but inside the warmth was steady and shared. Rows of folding chairs were perfectly aligned. Chuck stood near the exit in full uniform, hands behind his back, saying nothing but present in a way that required no words. At the front of the room, Lydia adjusted her bifocals and looked down at the neat list of names. We'll proceed alphabetically, she said. Please take a slip, mark your vote, and place it in the box. No one spoke. The first resident approached the table, wrote carefully, folded the slip, and dropped it in. Then another, and another. No side conversations, no dramatic glances, just quiet steps and deliberate motion. It was, Ruth thought, like watching a church offering with gravity added. Chuck had said earlier that day over a mug of black coffee in the cafe. You'd be surprised how loud silence can be when people finally decide to use it. Now that silence was deafening. Beverly sat off to the side alone, masked in a pale blue cloth patterned with pink magnolias. Her eyes flicked to each neighbor as they passed, searching maybe for a familiar smile, a nod of allegiance. None came. She didn't speak, but her fingers twitched over her clipboard. Edgar sat halfway down the center row, arms resting on the polished head of his cane. He hadn't brought a binder or his briefcase or even a notepad, just a quiet presence and a straight back. Ruth sat beside him, hands clasped, watching each vote as if it were a bell rung gently in a far tower. Carl and May sat 2 rows up, their hands linked between them. May gave a tight smile when her name was called, then returned to her seat with the careful grace of someone who understood the weight of paper and ink. Elliot, at a separate table, handled the tally. He didn't speak either, just marked small hash lines with the patience of someone trying to make things right. When the final name was called, Lydia closed the hat box and exhaled slowly. She stood still for a moment, then began to open and count. 1, she said softly, yes. 2, yes. 3, yes. The room remained silent, but breaths shifted. Shoulders eased slightly. 28, yes. 29, yes. 30, yes. 31, yes. Pause. 32, no. 33, no. 34, no. 35, no. Lydia lifted the last slip. 36, abstain. She looked up. The final count, 31 votes, yes, 4. No one abstention. She glanced at the board, then out toward the room. The current HOA board is hereby suspended. An independent review will be arranged with oversight from third-party audit. No cheers, just a few nods. A quiet release like the sound of an old drawer finally clicking shut. Beverly stood slowly. her clipboard tilted to one side. Her mask muffled her voice, but her words carried just enough. "You think this is over?" Edgar turned voice low but crisp. "I think it's finally begun." We suspend the board," he said. "Tonight." Edgar's driveway was warm under the November sun. His car hadn't moved. It didn't need to. The crispness of early fall had mellowed into a soft chill, the kind that coaxed sweaters out of drawers and filled porches with the smell of roasted yams and cinnamon. A row of red and white tablecloths stretched across Carl and May's front lawn, catching the light like a quilt of stories. Above, an American flag swayed gently from its pole, its motion steady, unhurried. Edgar sat on the porch in his old wooden chair, the one Ruth had dusted off and declared officially back in rotation. A ceramic mug steamed in his hand. Next to him, Ruth placed a covered dish on the table before settling into her own seat with a gentle sigh. From across the street came the laughter of children darting between parked cars, clutching construction paper cards in pumpkin orange and acorn brown. One peeled away from the group, ran up the steps, and pressed something into Edgar's hand, a folded card scribbled with marker crayon. "Thank you for fixing the rules." He smiled, tucked it into the pocket of his flannel shirt. The new interim HOA board had been voted in last week. No grand speeches, just neighbors willing to sweep their own sidewalks and each other's if needed. The bylaws had been rewritten and posted online with a paper copy pinned to the cafe bulletin board, right below Lydia's coupon for free cider refills. Inside the house, a radio played soft jazz while Ruth basted a turkey with a calm precision that could quiet any chaos. Edgar had taken a moment earlier to reread the final version of the HOA guidelines. No loopholes, no special clauses, just clear expectations and a paragraph about transparency added at Ruth's suggestion. From down the block came Chuck, no uniform today, just a thick sweater and a foil-covered tray balanced in his arms. He nodded at the kids, raised a hand to Carl, and climbed the porch steps like a man finally ready to rest. "Brought my mother's stuffing," he said, setting the tray down. "It's mostly bread and butter. Nothing fancy." "Perfect," Ruth said, lifting the corner of the foil approvingly. "This looks just right." Chuck eased into a seat beside Edgar and stared out at the small gathering where Lydia was passing out slices of pie and May had looped string lights around the maple tree. "Guess you won," Chuck said quietly. Edgar shook his head, a slow smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't need to. The rules did." For a while, no one spoke. The sun dipped a little lower, casting a honeyed glow across the rooftops. A harmonica began to play Carl's tune, familiar and slightly off-key, but no one minded. Someone mentioned in passing that Beverly had listed her house. There were rumors of Florida, or perhaps Arizona, but no one gossiped. No one cheered. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes exits don't need an audience. Ruth stepped up behind Edgar and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Ready for what's next."